Oh, g'day everyone. Welcome back to the parenting segment of Papa Kainga or Home Learning TV. Just been looking at the feedback online. So, fair to say, most in New Zealand seem to be sort of reporting being kind of glad to take some time to reconnect with their family. I mean, it's a mixed bag. There's also people that are struggling and finding it really difficult. So we thought in light of that, today we would have a look at what makes us cope better. What are some of the strategies we can use or employ for our children that will help us through, and what are some of the supports that are out there for us for those that need more of that. One of the most common questions I get asked by people is why, when two kids come from the same family, do they cope in such different ways or to different levels? So maybe let's start by just addressing that. Why? To help understand why some people cope better than others, I thought it would be helpful for you to understand what the literature refers to as the risk and resiliency spectrum. So if you can imagine, here's you in the middle. Risk factors are all the things that happen that make you more vulnerable. That's why I've chosen this little vase I got from China, because it's very, very delicate and so very, very vulnerable, but still utterly beautiful. So if you have enough of those risk factors accumulated, what are risk factors? They're things like poverty, a parent who's been to prison, a parent who was in foster care, a parent that hits you as a form of discipline, being isolated from your extended family like grandparents, being transient and moving schools, a whole lot. I mean, that's not an exhaustive list, but you get the idea. If you end up with enough of these stress factors, then you end up down this end where you are delicate and vulnerable. Alternatively, what we call the well-supported end, or supported well-being. So I've used two Egyptian pillars. I wanted two to represent that it is about the amount of support you get. So it's very much a whānau and connection concept, and the golden pillar just representing strength and well-being. So what are the things the literature tells us leads to strength and well-being and resilience? Often they're the opposite to that, but resiliency factors that we've got clear evidence for are things like having involved grandparents, having an at-home parent in the first year of life. Actually, the longer you have an at-home parent, probably the more steps you take. Speaking more than one language, that helps to change your brain. We're going to do a topic on that later, but it's very, very good for your overall brain health. Learning a musical instrument is actually very similar. Having high quality relationships with your teacher at school is another resiliency factor. You get the idea. Again, not an exhaustive list, but if you have enough of these resiliency factors, then you end up down here where we find in all the longitudinal studies, people that have enough of that support, they end up down this end. Well, this is associated with, not just good qualifications and good earnings and low imprisonment rates, but good mental health and good overall well-being. So the reason I wanted you to understand that is because I think it's an easy way to understand why some people who are already, say, in a single parent family, are isolated from their extended family. Maybe there's been some domestic violence in the family. Maybe they've moved recently to a new area so don't have social contacts. Maybe there's some diagnosis of mental health in the parent's history or the child's. So it's those accumulation of risk factors that actually makes the person vulnerable and delicate. It's not an inherent quality in the person so much, because if we add the appropriate supports to this person, if we give them support networks that they can reach out to, if we enhance their family networks, if we encourage the use of their own indigenous language or learning a second language, if we encourage them to play a musical instrument, if we maybe encourage them to have the same or go to a school where they have the same teacher for 2 or 3 years, so we have this high quality relationship. It's really our responsibility, not so much to blame this little golden orb for where they find themselves on the spectrum, but to support them to find things that we can do to add supports so they end up down here where we want everyone to be, in supported well-being. So the genetics that the child brings to the party also has a role to play in that. It's just that it's not determined by that. People used to think the resilience resided entirely in the child, and what you've seen from the last example is it's actually to do with how well supported that we are. But genes also play a role, so to explain that we might have to introduce a few more children to the family. So here we go, we've got an Egyptian, a Chinese and an English. Come from my hometown where everyone's got different father. No, that's just a joke. So here we've got all the kids in the family, and genetically, even though they've got the same mum and dad, they don't actually get the same disposition towards, or genetic predisposition towards something like anxiety. We all get our own genes. So it might be that, you might have been born with a particular disposition towards being anxious genetically, right? but you're not the firstborn child, you've got an older sibling, and your older sibling, say this one, was firstborn, and they only have a little bit of a disposition towards, if this is the middle mark, they've only got a little bit of a genetic predisposition. We could say the other two children, this one won the genetic lotto and was born genetically way down this end, where they're really genetically predisposed to not have things like anxiety and depression, and this child's got quite a good predisposition towards good outcomes, but is not as much as the other sibling. So now what I want you to understand from this is that genes alone don't dictate. It's not going to be, well, the eldest child is slightly over the centre, so they're going to have a little bit of anxiety. This child, you, are going to have a lot of anxiety, and they're not going to experience anxiety, because genes don't dictate that outcome. That might be where our genes put us. You might have been down this end. Let's start with the eldest in this family, actually. This has a slight disposition towards anxiety and depression, but because she's the eldest, that's actually a huge leap forward. There's lots of advantages in being the firstborn child, all the extra attention that you receive in the first 1,000 days of life. That was what the 90s were about, really. Discovering your outcomes aren't determined by genes, but in fact a lot to do with the first 1,000 days of life. So, and this first child didn't have to share their caregiver in the first year of life, because that was mum's only kid. So that advantage puts them in the middle, and they don't ever develop an issue with anxiety and depression. And that's without considering all the other things that we talked about before, about this child might be bilingual and might have the same teacher at school for a 3-year period and has really involved grandparents, and so actually is well down that end, even though she started out with a disposition here. Same thing for you. You might not have been the firstborn child here, but maybe you had a particularly close relationship with your grandparents. Maybe you learned a musical instrument. Let's say you learned that musical instrument before the age of 7, started to learn before the age of 7, you get 2 steps for it, because the brain's just got so much more neuroplasticity at that early stage. You've got a particularly close relationship with a sports coach. Basically I'm trying to get you to see that even though you might have had quite a strong disposition towards that, you can add features that take you well up down this end. I also want you to understand that just because this child has landed up down this end is not a guarantee that they're not going to suffer from anxiety and depression. No one remains stationary on that. This child might have been born with that predisposition, but if this child goes through, some sort of horrific childhood trauma, say there's a parent dies and a close member dies in their early care, for some reason they just happen to be born at the wrong time and the family are incredibly transient for a period of their life, so they experience multiple schools and multiple educational settings. Say the grandparents die during the formative years. I don't want to load you down with all the trauma, but I'm just trying to get you to see that this child who was born here is not immune to anxiety and depression, because you put them under enough stresses and they will also end up down this end. So I'm just trying to get you to think about being supported well-being or being delicate and fragile. Yes, your genes play a role in that, but really we can't change your genes. What we can change is the amount of support that we give the individual, so that we can move them down to this end of being well-supported well-being. Kia ora whānau. We can help our children develop resilience just simply in the way that we play with them. And it's to do with not taking the lead so much and trying to problem solve for the child, like not telling them exactly how do we get the carriage to fall out, like which buttons that we have to push, but to allow them to discover those sorts of things for themselves. Our role as a parent is really to aid them to learn to be problem solvers. So rather than aiding them to get to the answer, you want to aid them to learn how to get to the answer through problem solving. So asking questions like, what are some other ways that we could do it? I never thought of that. And then when your child does suggest ways, even if you know that way's not going to work, letting him follow through and supporting him to follow that through so he can work out for himself that it doesn't work. It's not about whether the solution works or not, it's about listening to that child's voice and trusting and developing their own problem solving techniques. So it's slower and takes longer, but it gets more resilient children in the long run. And remember, whānau, take some time just to chill. It's not just about your role in looking after others, you also have to practice some self-care. So even if that's only 10 minutes, grabbing a cup of coffee on the couch and relaxing, kicking back, it's important that your children see you looking after yourself, because children use you as a yardstick to see how they're supposed to cope and what they're supposed to do. It's called social referencing in the literature, but really it's just if you want children who are going to look after themselves and take the steps to remain calm, and do the things they need to, then they need to see the parent doing the same thing. So don't feel guilty about grabbing 10 minutes on the couch with a cup of coffee. It's good for you, it's good for the kids. Okay, we've come to the end of our time. We said we'd leave you with some excellent resources and links that would be helpful. So of course we can't go past the good old Plunkett line. So the number's going across the screen now for Plunkett line. Also Bernardo's, they've got a 0800 WhatsApp number. That is, they've got a long history of supporting families in lots of different situations, so those resources are there, use those. The Ministry of Education has got a Tips for Toddlers that's published on their webpage. I think I'm going to get that and put that on my webpage as well, because that's got some excellent strategies for supporting toddlers through this time. Okay, keep your feedback rolling in. Once again, we really appreciate it, and I appreciate all of your support. So, we'll see you next time. Kia ora koutou katoa, ka mihi nui kia koutou.